Hello. Hi, we are it so far, but it's still a few minutes early. So
Great. Well, I had people asking about the link on YouTube. So we've got folks I know.
the YouTube link is live. Obviously, it's just you and me right now.
Yeah, I see it. I'm going to mute so I don't.
Hello, how are you?
Good afternoon.
People are just slowly beginning to add themselves. So
Hi, Melanie.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you.
You too.
Got an email with all the great stuff that you're doing at Kent State. We'll pass that on.
The newsletter. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Wilder. Hi, Andy. Hi, Rick.
Hello, hello. Hi, Melanie.
Hi. How are you?
Can't complain. Got my run in before the meeting.
Nice.
Got back-to-back meetings tonight, so.
I ran home and walked
Hi,
the dog,
everyone.
and that's it.
Hi, Andy.
Hi.
We'll give it a few more minutes. It's just 5:29 now, and see if we have any more join us. Some might just want to watch from YouTube, which is fine.
Hi, Bill. Good to see you.
Hello. Hi, Renee. Andy.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. Oh, Melanie, Bridget, boy, everyone's there. Bye.
Hi, Bill. Well, Renee, we do have the only 3 members of the Sustainability Commission present. We have several members from the ad hoc committee present as well that are just joining. So maybe in a minute or two, you can get it, open the meeting, and then we'll transition over to the presentation.
Excellent.
Well, you think we should start? It's
All
5:30.
right, yes, I will go ahead and call the Sustainability Commission to order. Roll call. Wilder,
Here.
Andy, and Rick,
Here.
and let's see, Mary Jane is not here. Hopefully she'll be joining us, and I think that's it, right?
Yeah, we have a vacancy,
And
correct.
myself. All right, yes. And then we have our members of the ad hoc committee here as well. So our order of business today is to hear a report from the ad hoc committee. So Andy, Botang, go ahead and take it away.
Well, before Andy starts, I'd like to give a little introduction about Andy, because I am aware of his credentials, and I know that Melanie and some others that have worked with Andy are. But I think it might help to fill everyone in that's new to the process about the primary help on the project. Hold on, somebody's joining, so let me add them. Okay, well, today's presentation on the status of the greenhouse gas inventory, which is part of the larger action plan, is going to be done by Andy Botang. He's a doctoral candidate. Andy is the lead geospatial analyst with the Davie Resource Group right here in Kent, Ohio. He currently manages Davie's climate change services and corporate greenhouse gas emissions inventory system. Andy is responsible for leading the implementation of Davie's strategy on climate change that capitalizes on the organization's current expertise and facilitates the goal of being a recognized leader in the development and dissemination of climate smart solutions. Andy coordinates Davie's efforts aimed at climate change adaptation and mitigation through the application of a geospatial analysis, predictive modeling, and the design of cartographic products used advancing GIS remote sensing software. Andy is also responsible for customizing urban tree resource analysis tools such as UTrace. The city actually uses that. Oh, Mary Jane's joining. One moment, I'm just going to let her in. which he built to assist cities modeling tree planting scenarios to meet canopy goals and develop urban forestry management strategies. Prior to joining Davey, Andy worked with Environmental Applications and Technology Center and Environmental Protection Agency in Ghana, where his work focused on Ghana's climate action and resilience planning and climate change policy. Andy is a national representative to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He's organized fora on a climate change in Europe and in Africa. And he was a research teaching assistant at the University of Akron, where he tutored geography of cultural diversity, and is currently working on his doctoral dissertation at Kent State University, which focuses on urban climate change mitigation, multi-agency collaboration aimed at addressing climate change. Andy has experience in the development of climate adaptation and resilience plans, inventory of greenhouse gas emissions and climate policy, which he's working on with us, plan and program implementation. He also has played a lead role in this ad hoc committee's work for the Sustainability Commission's tasked with creating the City of Kent's Climate Action Plan. He was a guest speaker at the 2019 environmental film series addressing anthropogenic climate change and a panel member at the fall 2018 Global Issues Forum, Countdown to Climate Catastrophe, that was hosted by Kent State University College of Communication and Information. At this point, I'm going to turn, I'm guessing he's going to share his screen, and the meeting over to Andy so he can give you a status on where we are and the next steps. But as you can see, we're very fortunate to have a volunteer with his pedigree working on this for you. I am nothing more than his assistant. I move paper. Thanks, Andy. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be with you and to work with you on the City of Kent's Climate Action Plan. So I'll be giving an update on the city's, the status of the project, and like Bridget mentioned, go on to mention the current steps and the next steps with regards to this project. So I'll go ahead and start here. All right, so this is just an introduction into what exactly the Climate Action Plan that the city is creating is all about. I'll start first by mentioning, the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, definition of climate change, because this whole plan, it's premised on climate change and its impacts and the need to build resilience so that normal life and property and all the activities associated with it can continue unabated. So I'll mention briefly here what climate change is. Okay, so climate change is a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods, usually 30 years. And so Climate Action Plan, therefore, is a detailed and strategic framework for measuring, planning, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and related climatic impacts. Climate action plans at a minimum include an inventory of existing emissions, reduction goals or targets, and analyzed and prioritized reduction actions. Let me mention here that the City of Kent passed a resolution in 2017 in support of the Paris Climate Accord of 2015. And then on the right side, I have what a climate action plan entails, the various steps that need to be covered, for a climate action plan to be conducted. So first step is the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, then the adoption of a target, a reduction target, then the development of a climate action plan, and here it is the adaptation and resilience plan, or also a mitigation plan based on the findings from the inventory and then the adoption of the reduction targets. Then we move to phase 3, which is going to develop the adaptation and resilience plan or the mitigation plan. Then step 4 looks at the implementation of the policies that have been identified based on all 3 previous steps. And then step 5 is where you monitor and track progress. And step 6 is where you recognize achievement. So I'll move on to the next slide. And here I'll touch briefly on what the Paris Climate Accord entails. Now, given that the City of Kent's Climate Action Plan is in support of the Paris Climate Accord, I think it's very important for us, given that we have new members joining us as well, and the general public here as well. I'm going to touch briefly on what the Paris Climate Accord is all about and what it's, if a city is conducting a climate action plan in support of this accord, what will be the key things that we expect to see in the climate action plan. All right, so the Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 parties at COP21. COP is the Conference of Parties in Paris on 12 December 2015 and entered into force on 4 November 2016. Its goal is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels. To achieve this long-term goal, countries aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible to achieve a climate neutral world by mid-century. The Paris Agreement, adopted through Decision 1, CP21, COP21, addresses crucial areas necessary to combat climate change. Some of the key aspects of the agreement are set out below. I put here, this is the Paris Climate Accord documentation as provided by the United Nations, and then what the resolution in support of the Paris Climate Accord as signed by the mayor, just right below it. I'm privileged to mention that I was part of the team that drafted the resolution in support of the city's support to the Paris Climate Accord. And it was an exciting process, I must mention. So key things I want us to take away from the Paris Climate Accord is that, number one, is it has a long-term temperature goal as a focus, okay? So the Paris Agreement, in seeking to strengthen the global response to climate change, reaffirms the goal of limiting global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius, while pursuing efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. So here, I think the most important thing is that for our climate action plan, given that we are conducting a greenhouse gas inventory, which is essentially estimating, all emissions of heat trapping and emitting gases, which account for global warming. And here, the long-term temperature goal being, looked at, which is the 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think this is why it's critical, for us to do that, that first step, because it is the various efforts by cities and communities to reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. We go into the atmosphere, trap heat and emit heat, which contribute largely to the global temperature here. So that is very key to what we are doing. And, as we develop plans and policies going forward, this is very critical for us to take note. Then mitigation. The Paris Agreement establishes binding commitments by all parties to prepare, communicate, and maintain a nationally determined contribution, NDC, and to pursue domestic measures to achieve them. Then also central in this Paris Climate Accord is sinks and reservoirs. So the accord seeks to encourage parties to conserve and enhance and appropriate sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. Okay, so anything that is taking those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere is what is captured here as sinks and reservoirs. Then adaptation. The Paris Agreement establishes a global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change in the context of the temperature goal of the agreement. So given that this currently climate change impacts are affecting various activities here in communities and nations and cities all over the world, it becomes necessary, therefore, to have an adaptive capacity enhanced and resilience strengthened to be able to adapt to this changing climate. And then also the loss and damage. Paris Agreement recognizes the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change, including extreme weather events and slow onset events, and the role of sustainable development in reducing the risk of loss and damage. And then also transparency, implementation, and compliance. The agreement relies on a robust transparency and accounting system to provide clarity on action and support by parties and flexibility for their differing capabilities. Okay, so the question here is why localize a global agreement? So if the city of Kent is embarking on a climate action plan in support of a global treaty, why is that critical? You know, why localize a global agreement? So number one, cities are home to half the world's population. They produce around 75% of the world's GDP, gross domestic product, and greenhouse gas emissions. By 2050, between 65% and 75% of the world population is projected to be living in cities, with more than 40 million people moving to cities each year. That's around 3.5 billion people now, rising to 6.5 billion by 2050. So cities like Kent have the power to change the world because they are the birthplace of some of humankind's greatest ideas, and they are the hubs of commerce, culture, and innovation. So therefore, cities have that unique power, okay, to make an impact, you know, when it comes to this global agreement. Now, also, there are differential impacts of climate change across regions, cities, and states. So cities play a pivotal role in ensuring that there is adaptation and mitigation to climate change impacts. So this is why there's the need to localize a global agreement. So this largely explains why the city of Kent has embarked on this climate action plan. So first of all, step one is the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. So I asked the question, what is a greenhouse gas emissions inventory? It's the estimate of all emissions and removals of greenhouse gases from given sources or sinks from a defined region in a specific time period. Now, it is more than just a report, and it should be viewed as a broader analytical program. And so I think that is one thing that we'll have to take away from today's presentation, is that the inventory is a broader analytical program on itself, because it gives us an overview of the emissions, the sources, the sinks, and if we need to adapt or mitigate the release of greenhouse gases, where to focus on. So here I show a picture of you know, the sources of greenhouse gas emissions within the city. It's in three broad scopes. Scope one is emissions from direct sources on site. So you know, from an activity. So let's say you are producing something, maybe a company, or let's say in the residential area, you're using energy. Okay, as you use energy, this generates emissions, or you're producing X amount of commodities. It generates some emissions because the activity data is going to translate into emissions. And so you want to make sure that you have that accounted for as well. Scope two is emissions from energy and utilities, the transmission and all of that, you know, making sure that we have power in our homes to power all our equipment and all of that, and that generates emissions. Scope three is indirect emissions of the chain supply or service. So aviation, you know, everything in that order, shipping, the transportation of goods and services, all of that generate emissions as well. So the basic idea here is emissions is a product of the emission factor and the activity data. The activity data essentially is the operational data that comes out of an activity that humans embark on. So the fundamental formula here is emissions equals to EF, emission factors, which is the coefficient that translate the activity data into emissions, like I previously mentioned, and the activity data itself. So, and I have just a brief explanation of that. E emissions equals to CU, the conversion factor, if it's fuel burnt, gigajoules as explained there, and then the product of that and the emission factor as well. So for our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, what the City of Kent is doing is identifying institutions and data required. The city has gathered data for initial inventory estimates and initiated documentation and archiving, which is key for a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, because what you want to do is you want to inventory your emissions over a period of time so that you can do your trend analysis, you can know what the key sources, know how well your policies, plans, and programs are yielding results and all of that going forward. So then we determine the methodology, which essentially is based on the formula as I explained in the previous slide. And we've conducted emissions, and completed the text sections. The text sections are, where you provide an additional information, to explain what exactly has been calculated in there for that particular sector. Then we have undertaken the QA, QC. And over there, this is where we cross-check the data, make sure that it's lining up with all data in the city's books, and making sure that everything tallies and that the emissions are actually accurate. And so we've done that for the other sectors, and in a little bit, I'll just get to those sectors and show you what the emission calculations are. Then we put in place a city-wide inventory system, because there has to be a system where data comes in, data is archived, data is documented, data is put into the inventory software, which for this particular one, we're using the ICLEI ClearPath Pro. ICLEI stands for International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. And so they have the ClearPath Pro software, which the city uses, and many cities across the world use that as well. And so we're using that for the estimation of greenhouse gas emissions. And then we are undertaking the key source analysis, preparing the draft citywide inventory report, subjecting what we've done to expert and interagency review, respond to the reviews, and then it goes on and on until we submit the inventory to City Council. Now, it's very important that we note that also that there are some guiding principles, okay, that govern the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the City of Kent is doing that. Number one, you have to identify what protocol you'll be using, to conduct your emissions. And so for that, we're using the GPC, which is the Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions. And there are certain accounting principles that should govern your estimation of emissions. Okay, number one, it has to be transparent, it has to be accurate, it has to be consistent, it has to be complete, it has to be comparable. And then it goes on to say, make sure you factor in your QA, QC, you've accounted for all uncertainties regarding the data and the estimation of emissions, and also the efficient use of resources. Okay, so that builds a very sustainable mechanism in place for you to do future or subsequent greenhouse gas emissions inventories. So the software, like I mentioned, is the ICLEI ClearPath Pro, the protocol, GPC. Okay, let me mention here some of the benefits to using the GPC, which is the protocol. Number one, it provides a very robust framework for accounting and reporting citywide greenhouse gas emissions. It also seeks to help cities develop a comprehensive and robust greenhouse gas emissions inventory in order to support climate action planning, because that is fundamental to the whole climate action planning process. Because without data, which establishes a baseline, which then gives you a basis to your reduction targets and track your performance, you can't have an effective climate action planning put in place. Okay, so also it enables city inventories to be aggregated at subnational and national levels Okay, and then it demonstrates the important role the cities play in tackling climate change and facilitates insight through benchmarking and aggregation of comparable data. So for the City of Kent's inventory, first of all, we needed to establish the year for the baseline metrics, and the year is 2016. And then also we had to define our boundary, the temporal boundary, which is the 2016, the year, and then also our geographical boundary. So are we estimating emissions for which boundary specifically? Is it the City of Kent's fiscal boundary? Does it include any other territories or related space that the city has in its name? So we made a decision to restrict this inventory purely to the boundaries within which the City of Kent lies. So it's the City of Kent's fiscal boundary we're using here. So residential energy from the subsectors there. So stationary fuel combustion and then grid electricity, you have those emissions calculated there. In the subsequent slides, I'm going to show you what the total for residential energy has calculated up to this point based on data we've received, modeled, etc. What the emission estimate is as calculated. Then also AFOLU, which is agricultural, forestry, and land use sector. We've calculated AFOLU emissions from the removal of forests, which factors in the change in land cover class to forests, etc. And what the estimations for carbon dioxide equivalent in metric tons are. Then also for commercial energy, we have grid electricity calculated there. So which shows in excess, just a little bit less than 12.5 K metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent. Then transportation and mobile sources, we have public transit calculated there and also rail transportation. Now, if you look at rail transportation, you can see it's really very significant under this particular sector. And the reason is that for rail transportation, there's a lot of diesel use as the fuel. And so diesel emits a lot. It's not the most efficient fuel for this type of operation from a climate standpoint. And so you see it emitting a lot, carbon dioxide equivalent metric tons over there. And then also solid waste. So waste generation for the City of Kent, generating in excess of 20,000 carbon dioxide equivalent metric tons. And so when you do the sectoral analysis to determine what is the key source, as calculated based on data we've received, data we've modeled so far, it shows residential energy in the lead, followed by solid waste, then transportation and mobile sources, commercial energy, and then AFOLU, which is agricultural, forestry, and land use. So here, clearly we see where the key sources of emissions are. The projection is that transportation and mobile sources should have some more because there's this data that we're processing at the moment to have it into the software. And the reason is that what we modeled so far, we're working with AMATS to refine some numbers because they have some good information there, which we didn't have initially. But now that we have it, we're going to make sure that we model, based on their data. And the projection is that we're going to have some more from the transportation and mobile sources sector. Now, in most city scale inventories, you have residential energy and transportation, mobile sources being the top two. And so even as it stands now, we see solid waste slightly ahead, generating more emissions than transportation and mobile sources. But then the projection is that we should have some more emissions coming from this sector. So the report that we're putting together for the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions is going to reflect the brief description of emission sources. We've gathered all the data. We've looked at all the emission sources. If you look at the subsectors, for instance, under the various sectors, you can see waste generation, you could see grid electricity from the residential sector and all of that. So you're going to see the emission sources, and what the numbers or the metrics that were calculated are. Then a list and justification of specific inclusion or exclusion of sources. And also, let me mention here that there are certain activities that are not occurring because there's a notation in greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which we give it an NO, which is not occurring. So some of the sectors or the subsectors, clearly, we don't have it happening here in the city of Kent. And so you will see that also reflected in the data. Then the comparative information from previous years. Let me mention here that we don't have, this is the first one we're doing. We don't have a previous year for this inventory. So it's going to be based on some data that I'm going to be providing. I'm working on that, particularly as part of my dissertation at Kent State University, as was previously mentioned. And so that's going to look at 2010 to 2015 data, but that's going to be for the two main sectors, which all projections and indications point to the fact that they're going to be in the lead. So residential energy and transportation and mobile sources sector. And so that will be the comparative analysis there for those two key sources. Then the reporting period, that will be covered, as mentioned previously, any trends evident in the data, progress towards any reduction targets, which I'll get to shortly. And then a discussion of uncertainties in the activity of fuel use or emission data as reported, what their likely causes, recommendations on how data can be improved. Everything will be captured in the report for step 1. And then a description of events and changes that have impacted the reported data, like closures. And interestingly, let me mention that if we were estimating emissions, which we'll get to in the future for year 2020, we most likely are going to see some changes in the data. Let me put it this way, because 2020 was quite an unusual year. We saw emissions dip at some point, and then things got back up, but that should reflect to some extent in the entire operation data, the activity data that is gathered, fuel use and all of that. Certain sectors definitely will be lower, and certain sectors will have more, because when commute and vehicle miles travel gets reduced, and then some residential energy use increases because more people are working from home and all of that. Waste generation and all those other sectors as well. Then changes of reporting boundaries and calculation methodologies applied will be reflected in the report. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the adoption of reduction targets. The procedure that we have in place is to, number one, review the emissions inventory, identify the emission sources, the scopes, and the drivers. But it's accounting for those metrics, okay, which is the data that is going into the software that is accounting for that. So if you pick a subsector, what are the drivers? Is it vehicle miles traveled? Is it fuel combustion? Is it the population? Is it all those type of things will be captured in there. Okay, and then alignment with existing county, state, or regional goals. Okay, and then the review of climate science and common targets, set short-term, medium-term, and long-term targets, and then we present the reduction targets for adoption by the City Council. Now, there are two main approaches that we have identified to use for this step. Okay, the fixed level goals, which is going to represent a reduction in emissions to an absolute emission level in a target year. So we're going to say, for instance, 2030, what is the percentage by which we want to reduce our emissions? And then another one is the base year intensity goals, which represent a reduction in emissions intensity relative to an emissions intensity level in a historical base year. So that's where you see the population, you see GDP, you see energy use, all that factored into that calculation. So we'll use these two main approaches to estimate that. Now, here I mentioned that the key source from the preliminary results and residential energy is in the lead in terms of source of emissions, and then the transportation and mobile sources are projected to follow. And then after that, we should have waste sector also coming close third. Then also, I'd like to point out that for this step, we're looking at all those existing county, state, and regional goals, when it comes to climate change mitigation. And so, for instance, I put here the city of Cleveland and their 45% reduction goal they have set for 2030, and then the net zero emissions by 2050 that they have set. Now, it's important to note that once you have these reduction targets set, you align your policies, plans, and programs, okay, to make sure that you're on course to meeting those reduction targets. Now, there are certain things like population, for instance, GDP. You want to have GDP growth, you want to have population growth, you want to attract more people to your area. So there are certain variables that you want to keep growing, but then you want to grow them in an effective way, in a more sustainable way, so that they are not contributing largely to your emissions from the various sectors that we looked at. So some of the other cities that we'll be looking at for their reduction targets are particularly the college towns, okay? College towns with a similar socioeconomic fiber like the city of Kent. I think it's very critical here that we focus more on the college towns, because college towns are very unique in terms of its population, at different times of the year, activities, GDP. I mean, a whole lot of things go into, the unique fiber of a college town. So it's very critical that we use some of those college towns. And if they have reduction targets, we want to look at their reduction targets and what's going into it, and look at our unique scenario and see where it will be applicable, which sectors it will be applicable, which subsectors, and then we can embark on that as well. So presently we have the key source based on preliminary results. We see where it's coming from. We see which subsectors are accounting for that. What are the drivers, all of that. So that will be critical for this step as we move ahead. Then also, this particular phase, the development of climate adaptation and resilience plan, we've done some extensive work on that. This involves some large steps and procedures, or assessments that need to be conducted. Because here you're looking at your climate adaptation plan, you're looking at your climate resilience plan. So it involves a whole lot. Number one is the exploration of hazards, because what are the climate hazards? What are the climate risks? What impacts are expected in the city of Kent? All of that. Because you need to know that to factor that into your plan. Because if your plan doesn't capture these, then your plan will most likely not be suitable, to building resilience to climate change. So you want to make sure you have all these factored in. So first of all, we have conducted the investigation of regional climate. Okay, so here we recognize climate trends and potential hazards. What temperature and precipitation amounts are normal for the city of Kent in different seasons. What events have caused damage in our community in the past year? Where have new developments or road building occurred in the city of Kent over the last decade? So in the next slides, I'm going to show you what has been done there. Investigation of regional climate. Here you look at the average temperature. So all of these are going to be captured in the report for this second, this is the third phase. Okay, so the first phase is the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. Phase 2 is the adoption of the reduction targets. Phase 3 is the development of the climate adaptation and resilience plan. Okay, all right, so average temperature for the city of Kent, as you can see there, compared to the national and the state temperature measurements for different months. Precipitation as well, average number of days with 0.1 inch of or more precipitation. Snow, average annual snowfall. Okay, investigation of regional climate continues with average number of days with 1 inch or more snow depth. Humidity, that's the average annual humidity. Average number of days with 0.1 or more precipitation in a year, wind speed, all those things captured in there. And so these are going to be in the report because we have to establish what is the normal, okay, but temperature and precipitation amounts and other variables are, normally for the city of Kent. Okay, so it continues here. So the question here is, what events have caused damage in the city of Kent in the past? Okay, so using data from the National Weather Service, from NOAA, we have all of these information that we've gathered. The NOAA Storm Events Database, and severe thunderstorms by year, annual rainfall, total exceeding records, and all of that. All this information is going to be captured in the report. What events have caused damage in the city of Kent in the past? Health-related emergency, vector-borne disease, flooding, temperature extremes, severe thunderstorms, tornadoes, etc. Are the key events. Okay, then to answer the question of where new developments have occurred in the city of Kent over the last decade, I conducted a land cover change assessment, okay, to determine where the gains and losses are between year 2006 and 2016. So it's looking at the various land cover classes: settlement, wetland, cropland, grassland, forest. Okay, and it shows in between 2006 and 2016 where the gains and losses are. So this metric here shows you what the gains and losses are in acres. And then the next change, okay, so some land cover classes gain and lose. Okay, so if you look at forest, for instance, and this is based on, let me mention here before I proceed with forest, that this is based on National Land Cover Data Sets, or NLCD data. Here, if you look at forest, for instance, forest, you see some areas will gain through the tree planting efforts and all of that. And then some areas are going to lose because there will be trees that were probably felled for development purposes, building new houses or new buildings, essentially. So you see the net change there, and also the table on the lower right corner. It shows the gains and losses, the net acreage, all of that there. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'll mention why these developments that have occurred are critical, to the impact of climate change in the city of Kent. So the further investigation of the regional climate, here we're looking at the projections under two emission scenarios: low emission scenario, high emission scenario. And so we're projecting all the way to 2035, which is the near term in climate change projections. So you see total precipitation, you see average daily max temperature, you see days with max temperature exceeding 95 degrees Fahrenheit. You see days where precipitation exceeds 2 inches, all of that over there. So this answers the question of what weather and climate conditions are projected for the city of Kent in future decades. Okay. All right, so projecting from 2020, I must mention. And further, we look at understanding exposure to climate hazards. Okay, so this has also been completed. We looked at what the potential hazards are, as mentioned in the previous slide: health-related emergency, including vector-borne diseases, because as the climate shifts, certain vector-borne diseases are likely to increase because it becomes, the weather becomes a compelling agent or factor, when it comes to those particular diseases. Flooding, temperature extremes, severe thunderstorms, tornadoes, droughts, etc. And so on the right side, you see where we identified assets. For those who were on that particular call where we looked at the assets within the city of Kent, this is just showing there's a word cloud of all those assets that we identified, which we broadly categorized under people, natural and environmental, assets, artificial or man-made, sociocultural, and then economic. So you see all the assets there. The assets are essentially the people, places, and services that are critical to the city of Kent's sustainable development. Okay, and then we went further to identify the climate and non-climate stresses, which essentially looks at the changes in the frequency and intensity. I use a lot of NOAA, National Oceanic Administration, and atmospheric metrics and all of that. They generate all of that. And then I looked at their state climate summaries. Okay, so you should see that based on the summaries they have for the state of Ohio, generally we're expecting an average annual temperature that has warmed by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, and it continues to rise. And the high emissions pathway, historically unprecedented warming is projected by the close of 21st century. Extreme heat in areas where high temperatures and humidity can cause dangerous health conditions. Significant increase in heavy rain events. Projected increases in winter and spring precipitation, raising risk of springtime flooding. Projected temperature increases leading to intensity of droughts. And then the next step we did here, to understanding our exposure to the climate risks, is that we conducted a land cover change assessment. Okay, now this assessment is critical, when it comes to the impact of climate change, because, for instance, if you have a projected increase in springtime flooding, and you have more impervious surface in your community because of the loss of forest cover and grassland, your coefficient of runoff is going to be increasing. Okay, you're going to have the incidence of flash floods because you're going to have the storm water curve is going to be sudden rise, and then it drops because you have a lot of rain or precipitation to deal with, and you don't have a lot of pervious surface, to seep into the soil. So you have a lot of runoff that happens as a result of that. So you'll see the gains and losses there, being critical to this whole resilience and adaptation plan, as we continue to put that together. And then the potential assets threatened by weather identified. Okay, and then so essentially people, infrastructure, natural resources. Here we're conducting a vulnerability assessment, for people, and then for infrastructure, and then for our natural resources. So in a scenario where you have temperature projected to increase, what is the impact for these assets that we identified in the city? Okay, and so we've also looked at, the potential tipping points, which essentially are the point, I'll call it simply the point of no return, where climate hazards, okay, climate risks, you factor all of that into that equation, it affects an asset. If the asset is not in a condition to be resilient to these impacts, and it continues, it hits a certain threshold, which is the point of no return, and you can't salvage that asset anymore. So it's very important that we identify what our potential tipping points are, and based on the adaptive capacity, the ability of the asset to withstand these climate impacts. So what we're doing there, and this assessment is in progress, it's looking at the social factors: age, income, mobility, rental households, minority status of the population, educational attainment, gender, all of that, for the assessment of the social fiber, to identify where the most vulnerable people are, based on the various variables like you have currently showing on the screen: age, income, mobility, and all of that. And then the physical factors, percent area impervious surfaces, like I mentioned. There's a high incidence of flash flooding in areas that have a high percentage of impervious surfaces. And then percent area in heat island. Okay, those areas have the tendency of high impact of heat, extreme heat. You will see infrastructure damaged, because when infrastructure it's under intense heat, it warms, it expands, it begins to buckle in some places, it begins to stretch and bend out of shape and all of that. So, and then percent buildings constructed prior to 1939, percent area in floodplain, percent without tree canopy and all of that. And then we also prioritizing assets whose damage will have a replaying effect or initiate large change in the overall system. And then the vulnerability assessment, like I mentioned, identifying the most vulnerable or important assets to protect, characterizing the risk based on sensitivity, adaptive capacity, all of that. And then we look at the characterization of risk. Excuse me. The estimation of the probability of loss. Okay, so if the assets we've identified, and particularly if we pick the people as an asset, we want to look at where we'll have based on age, based on income bracket, based on minority status, based on all of that, educational attainment and all of that, which section of the population, located in which areas will be impacted heavily. What's the probability of the loss? Based on all the projections we saw from temperature, precipitation, and all of that, humidity, and all of that, what will be the impacts? And then we reached a decision point, for those that we've conducted presently, given that we can accept the risk climate change or climate presents to the assets, we then proceed to the investigation of options. And so this just segues into the next steps that we'll be conducting in the next quarter. Because now we've looked at all the projections, we see where it's heading, we see where our assets are, we see where they are located, we see which assets, based on their unique composition or unique quality or ability to withstand these climate impacts, how will they fare, given all those projections that we saw earlier. So then it leads us into the investigation of options, which will be the next phase under this particular climate action plan as we conducting it. So here I'll just talk briefly about that, for everyone to just know, what will be done, under this investigation of options. Here we're developing a wide range of strategies, consulting with stakeholders to identify innovative solutions to reduce risk. There's a lot of benefit to conducting a wide range of strategies or developing them, because you don't want to narrow your adaptation or your resilience plan to certain strategies alone, because it has to be encompassing, it has to be comprehensive, it has to have a lot of length and breadth and depth, so it can adapt to the changes, because the climate projections as we know it, these are only projections, okay? So they'll be higher than the numbers, higher than the projections, and or lower, slightly lower than the projections, because most of these projections are very accurate, but then you want to have the ability to adapt to it. So you don't want to have it something in place and it's not robust enough, it doesn't have a lot of breadth and length enough to accommodate the changes, the slight changes that will come with these projections. And then also we're exploring case studies and adaptation planning resources, evaluating the potential solutions, refining the goals, as necessary, we adjust the goals and refine the, adjust the expectations and all of that goes with it. Okay. And then we consolidate the actions into a cohesive plan. Okay, so you want to make sure that all the plans, all the policies, all the strategies that we are looking at, we want to make sure that they fit. Okay? They don't impact on each other negatively. We want to make sure that we've explored the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and the threats, and making sure that all those come together in a cohesive plan. Let me mention also there that for my dissertation, I'm looking at the compatibility or otherwise of the plans, policies, and programs of two major stakeholders, the City of Kent and Kent State University, given that they have shared interests. We want to look at the how their plans are relating to each other, and making sure that they coordinate. So here, all the plans and policies that we identify here for this particular subsector, we want to make sure that they relate, they jive, there's no conflicting issues there. so that we can have it into a cohesive plan. And then also we estimate the expected value of each action, evaluate the trade-offs, and all of that. So I won't delve too much into that, but then for purposes of time. But then also we're going to be planning the project where we develop the timeline and milestones to mark the progress, decide order of implementation of options, which options should come first based on the emissions inventory. We saw the key source, we saw the areas to address first because they are emitting the most. What policies, what plans, programs can be put in place to identify, to reduce these emissions, involve stakeholders who invest in plan, okay, and encourage stakeholders and all of that. And so that's quite a lot there. So I won't delve too much into that. So I'd like to pause here and take some questions. So thank you for your attention. Bridget, I'll pass this back to you. So you pick it up from there.
Renee, can I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Obviously, it's very sophisticated for the average person. And, as an architect, I'm sort of on, I know a lot of what you're talking about, but, I've been sitting here thinking about what can the Sustainability Commission do as you continue to finalize the plan and present it to the public to help present it in a way that people can drill down and understand what the impact they can make as individuals are. The numbers of the, your overall numbers of the emissions, show that the residential sector is the largest sector in the city. So, that's something I'm thinking about, and I'm going to want to talk about not necessarily today, but in the future. I mean, what I'd be curious is how we can develop some peer, and I'm sure you've looked at it. You mentioned looking at peer communities that also have universities, for instance. Mm-hmm. I think it would be really interesting to see, what other communities like ours have done or are doing, and kind of what their emissions are compared to ours, yada, yada, yada. You know what I'm saying? So, okay. And then the other question I had, and it's not related to any of that at all, was when you mentioned rail transportation, are you saying trains that go through Kent do that emission, add into our carbon emission? Is that how you're thinking about that?
Yes. So thank you for your questions. Let me start with the last question, the rail transportation. And so we have a lot of cargo rail, ABC company, CSX company that goes through the city of Kent. And so for emissions under that sector, and particularly that sector, which is rail transportation, if the rail line goes through the city, we calculate for that section of the city where we have that activity occurring. Okay, so for that, we picked data that was provided by these companies, and then estimated the emissions based on the length of the rail line within our community. Okay. So
wow, that's a staggering number. That's a big number.
Yes, exactly. Wow, so if you look at their annual and more so because of the fuel use. Okay, so diesel and the numbers we're getting from there means that, we are emitting a lot from that particular subsector. So usually, maybe I can mention this. I'm sure some people here are quite familiar with that. The transportation sector, we have a lot of instances where, there's a point where that activity originates and then it can end somewhere else. Okay, so this is a very unique way to capture it, because if you pick vehicle miles traveled within the city of Kent, we have a lot of people commuting from neighboring communities, either coming to school, coming to work. So estimating these numbers, and that's why I mentioned that we're waiting for, trying to refine some numbers from AMATs, because that is a very complex, environment there, because you have a lot of neighboring communities that drive through your city. how do you account for the specific numbers and all of that. But for a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, yes, you'd have to account for the emissions that those activities,
Passing
are generated within, essentially.
passing through town.
Thank you. And then also how the Sustainability Commission can help. I think one of the key things we want to have in our plan is that we want a plan that is very relatable. We want a plan that the community can have a lot of buy-in. Okay, the community can identify specific things they can do, because if a plan is not doesn't include everyone, then you are most likely not going to get a lot of long-term sustainable buy-in from the people, because they have to identify what they can do over a period of time. What role can I also play? Because there are certain major decisions that have to be made, particularly regarding residential energy. But then you have to identify the specific things that people can do, like efficient lights, light bulbs, putting mechanisms in place to reduce their consumption, essentially, because every minute counts, is how I like to look at it, and it all generates that large number. And so I think there was a third question. I'm missing that. If you could go over that.
Rick, rather, Andy, I've got one.
Okay, great.
You pointed out earlier that Cleveland expects to have a 45% reduction by 2030.
Yes.
And net zero by 2050. And it occurred to me that's the same numbers that Biden's using for the country.
Yes.
In an ideal way. I wonder if, did you do any investigating of Cleveland and how they arrived at that number and what they're going to do so that they can achieve it? Or Cincinnati is also another city, a major city that's moving in that direction. Did you learn anything from other cities?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question. Let me mention one of the things that the city of Cleveland is doing a lot, particularly for the transportation and mobile sources sector. They are encouraging a lot of multimodal transportation, which I see the city of Kent also doing, increasing bike share from the bike share programs, okay? And also making sure, like the public transit, for instance, in the city of Kent, and so I've spoken to PARA and all those organizations, and they have a lot of great things that they want to put in place, or they've started actually, like for example, water use, for instance, they harvest rainwater to use for the washing of their buses and all of that, water use. They also have fleets now that use purely electric. They have that electric energy as a fuel. Infrastructure also put in place. When you go to the transit center, the parking deck there, you should find some nice innovative mechanisms they are putting in place, or strategies they are putting in place to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. So the city of Cleveland is doing a lot of these things, multimodal transportation, fuel use, and all of that. So I think that their 2030 goal is more realistic to me. The 2050 goals, given their projections, I think they, for what they are doing, I mean, it's yielding results already. It has reduced significantly their emissions, and so I see them. I think it's the strategy is to set the bar high, so you can put everything. Make sure you've covered all your, cross your T's, dotted all your I's, to make sure that you are hitting that target. So you don't leave out any option. So that's what the city of Cleveland is doing. And I think we have to do that also, to make sure that we've looked at everywhere to see what possible source, of emissions can be reduced. And then, improve on our sinks as well, increase our tree cover. I see a lot of work being done in that sector. And so, because Davey definitely is their partner there as well. So I think the more we increase our tree cover and the percentage as well, we're going to reduce, our emissions, largely. So
I think they're focusing Cleveland on wind energy as an alternative source, and Cincinnati, it's more solar farms that's going to provide energy. So
exactly, for the residential energy, yes, that reduces a lot.
Got our fingers crossed that they'll be able to achieve that, and us too.
Yes, yes. And I think, let me mention also that if you look at the United States emissions inventory, the target that was set, based on our participation earlier in the Paris Climate Accord, it was set at about, now presently we are about 17%, with our reductions as a country, so with the US getting back into the Paris Climate Accord and going back to the all our obligations, I see us moving towards that goal. And so we're going to see more cities have the resources, have the support to embark on these climate action plans, reducing their emissions and all of that. So we should have a national reduction ultimately. Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Andrews. It's been wonderful, all the information that you're providing again. Thank you for all your hard work. Other than the city of Kent and the university, are there other identified companies, groups, institutions within the city that have made a commitment at greenhouse gas reduction within their own company goals? Do we know of any?
Yes, I'll mention PADA, and that's because I've spoken, at length. I had a very long interview with them, and that's part of my dissertation. And so I got to see all their efforts and all their, strategies and everything they're putting in place. So PADA, number one, yes, I was very impressed with what they had there. It was like a very solid mitigation plan. So PADA is definitely one. I don't know of any particular company. Now, let me mention, of course, Davy is doing that. Okay, let me also mention that. I mean, outside of Davy, I'm thinking about the other companies. I don't know a lot regarding that, but Davy is putting a lot of efforts in place to reduce our carbon footprint. We have a corporate emissions inventory currently being worked on. So we are doing that. I think the idea is that we would have to engage with the members of the business community, essentially, and present this numbers, this metrics to them, and help them to identify areas where they can put measures in place to reduce their carbon footprint. I think that I think I've said this before, that when you are emitting more, you are not being efficient. This is just the statement, the scientific statement there. Because once you begin to emit more for a given process, it means that your process is not efficient. The combustion is not as efficient as it can be, because you're losing, if it's fuel, you're losing some amount of fuel in the combustion process, or you're losing your combustion essentially is not efficient. So if if you a certain activity and you emit, let's say, 10 gigagrams of carbon dioxide equivalent, and you can bring the emissions to 5, it means that you can use your fuel more and produce more. So I think for the business community, the idea is to let them see the economics of it, let them see the benefits, the dollar value, because of course they are in business for profit. But then we want to make sure that they see the benefit they bring to our climate as well, and how it ensures their sustainable development and all of that. Because you don't want impacts in your community that will derail all the investments you've made. Okay, so the idea is to engage them more as we go ahead.
Very good. I had a second question, quick one. On the transportation sector, were we able to factor in the off-road, like the lawn mowing, landscaping, construction work?
Yes, all those are going to be captured in there as well. There was some data that we gathered, and I know you did such wonderful work on that. So I've reviewed the data. I've seen where the gaps are, like we previously discussed, and so all that is going to get factored into the final for the transportation sector. With some numbers from AMATS, which we've begun the process. They've sent some data in, and we're reviewing the data as well.
Bridget, I saw your hand.
I think
Yes, thank you. I did want to highlight that just on Rick's comment about the density of the data, that is definitely recognized. I can tell you that that's the case with a lot of the other types of work the city does. So we would be working through, after that data is done and we have that action plan finalized, for lack of a better word, a summary that kind of points out some of the key points that were identified and propose suggestions for moving forward initiatives that can help address some of those. And that is definitely ones where we would be wanting the Sustainability Commission, the ad hoc group, and really anyone in the community that's interested in reducing greenhouse gas to work with us to get those done. An example I can give just of today, we just completed a 220-page rewrite of our zoning code update. I summarized that into a 4-page Cliff Note memo for council with bullets. So we would do a similar with this. However, the entire study with all the data and references to those base sources and the analyses will be available and made public, probably posted to the website through the Community Development Department webpage. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Got another comment, and Andy mentioned that transportation was the number 2 major sector causing some of the major emission releasing. And I had understood from a former member of the Sustainability Commission that they were considering replacing the older high mileage cars and trucks, police cars, and even buses with electric ones. And I wonder if the commission has done anything with that sector of transportation. I don't know who would be able to answer that. Maybe Bridget would know, but.
Just to clarify, Bill, solid waste was actually number 2. It was residential energy, solid waste, transportation, and mobile sector was third.
Thank you.
On the list, to clarify. And with regards to that type of initiative, again, we need this data and study done to show those priorities and then present those to council. Those types of substantive changes with regards to acquisition of a fleet of vehicles would be something subject to council review and consideration. So it's definitely something that when it comes out of this study, we can show that sector is third and present that to council to see how they would want to move forward with that. I can tell you right now, budgetary wise, we are running below levels because of COVID. Now, we did receive relief through the American Rescue Plan. However, how that's going to be eligible for application to the city's shortfalls has not been presented to us by the Department of Treasury. So I'm thinking our budget this year will be a steady course, but our study will be done. So being able to present that for council's consideration for 2022 or a forthcoming year, it definitely is something we will be doing.
Well, I was thinking of that because when cars need to be replaced, or trucks or buses, I don't know if we need to have a decision of council to decide whether to replace it with gas, oil, or with electric, or even hybrid. That would be something that the service department would be able to make without a vote from council, I would think. And it's a major release of emissions.
Actually, no, we cannot. We as administration have to have authorization from council for any change or renewal of any purchase or agreement. It's basically just the way that local government is structured. So our budget's approved, capital acquisition purchases are approved. Funds have to be legally appropriated by council for changes. So that would be something that the service department would present to council for sure, though. Or the police department, if we were talking about the patrol vehicles.
And what about school buses too? They're now electric school buses.
That would be to the Kent City schools that matter. So, but then again, if we have the study that could be shared through the Sustainability Commission or the Kent Environmental Council with the school district, because that data would be reflected in showing that transportation and mobile sector, but the city doesn't have any control over the school district's budget. So, but I'm sure they would love to see this information once it's ready.
How much interaction have we had with the school district? I can't recall. We had a contact there?
We have several contacts there depending on the nature of the project. At this point, they're pretty much working on trying to get operational with classroom. So this is not an issue that's at the fore. And again, until we actually have the study to share with them that shows the data that Andy is providing, it might time out just right, actually, but when we get the study done. They should be having the school back in session, I'm understanding, the next month or two. So it would be useful information for them going forward in their next budgetary cycle.
Anyone else who hasn't had a chance to ask a question?
I also want to thank Bridget for all of your hard work on this as well, Bridget. Don't want to leave you out.
Yes, thank you to both of you. This has been, Andy, this has been really helpful. Bridget, thank you so much for setting up this meeting and getting it all arranged. This is great information. We're looking forward to the next steps and how we can use this to, like Rick was saying, to help make real differences in people's lives in ways they can understand and wrap their heads around.
All the heavy lifting credit goes to Andy. I will tell you, most communities actually have to pay and hire a consultant that specializes in sustainability to do this. This initiative, the detail, the data, is definitely something that I am eternally grateful to Andy to do for us on a volunteer basis. We are extremely fortunate. So I tell everyone that all I do is move paper. Andy does all the heavy lifting. So thanks to Andy.
Thank you.
I wanted to make a
pleasure.
comment. This is Lorraine here.
Lorraine, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to thank Andy too for pointing us in the direction of getting involved, because I know we were struggling at the beginning of this committee with how do we collect this data. And, you know, he directed us to this international protocol because then it would be comparable with what other cities are doing. And I just wanted to make the Sustainability Commission aware that one of the things that we did look at a lot of other cities and their sustainability plans. And as part of the ICLEI training, we also did interact with other communities that are trying to get community involvement going in their communities. So that was very helpful. So there's maybe some sources to look at for the Sustainability Commission if they wanted to do that.
Thank you, Lorraine.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
I'm thinking about some of the big projects that I think a number of people have talked about, and those are solarizing the water reclamation plant, building a solar farm in a sense to provide that energy for one of the big uses of electricity in the city. So if we can get that information too, that would be helpful, the cost and how much time it would take and so forth. And also in relation to that, we were thinking, it was brought up to consider solarizing the new city hall, if that would be possible too. And I understand estimates have been given through Solar United Neighbors, SUN, and that would be helpful for the Climate Action Plan Committee to know too, as we think about applying all that data that's presented by Andy, and reducing greenhouse gases has to be number one, and residential, which would be really very appealing, perhaps to many citizens of Kent. I wonder if there's a possibility of a ballot initiative, perhaps, to apply some year as a recommendation to include an incentive of reducing the application of solar to your home and you get back 10% or something. That's
Thanks, Bill. That's, some of those things I think are really hinging on this plan being available and that information so that the city council, we can make those recommendations and the city council has data that they can use. Bridget, what would you?
Yes, that is true, Renee. Thank you very much. And they have run some of the numbers. I know that the solar panels for the new city hall, what can be supported an array on the top is actually not cost-wise. It wouldn't really make a big difference. However, I am happy to report that Kathy Petsko, our grants coordinator here in the Community Development Department, submitted a grant to the Ohio EPA to add 2 electric charging stations in the parking lot at the city hall, and the new city hall, and we just found out last week we got the full funding to do that. So there will be 2 designated spots for electric charging, and they're going to be open to the public, not just specific to anyone visiting, so you can actually plug your car in, go across the street, have lunch, and come back. So I did want to give credit to Kathy for that and to let you know that there is a focus and a look on sustainability, but it also needs to be within the confines of what the city can afford. So thank you.
Great. Anything else for the good of the order? Again, deep gratitude to Andy. Oh, did you want one last
Yes,
comment?
let me just thank you. Let me just mention that I'd also like to say thank you to my company, Davey, for all the support, because they provide all the technical support, the equipment, the software, and everything that goes into all the analysis I've completed so far. And so I want to say thanks for their support as well. They make it happen. So thank you. Mhm.
Great, thank you. Great corporate partnership. All right, so that's the extent of our agenda today. I would like to entertain a motion to adjourn. Is that you, Mary Jane? Okay, Mary Jane makes the motion. Do I have a second? Andy? Okay, Andy. All those in favor of adjourning? Show of hands. Any opposed? All right, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you again, Andy, for all of the amazing work that you're doing and for our staff support with Bridget. So, and for those of us who joined us on YouTube or who are maybe watching this recording.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you.
Everyone.